Hello, I'm David Morris. Well, DeepSeek, the Chinese AI sensation, is all over the news this week. It's the phenomenon because I think many people feel like it's a recognition that China is a real tech competitor now to the US. Now, I'm not sure that this is anything new necessarily, but in AI, and AI has been a field where we have assumed that the United States is well ahead of China. And this week's news, DeepSeek being able to launch a product that is so much cheaper and using so much less microchip power means that it will consume a lot less electricity, be much more efficient, arguably. So the observers believe, and so the market seems to believe. Almost $1 trillion wiped off values of high-tech stocks in the US. So it's been quite a sensation this week. I want to think behind this a little bit about what is going on here. Now, we all know that China has been moving from being the manufacturer of low-cost products into becoming a high-tech producer. What we often don't think about is how there's a bit of a parallel there with Japan of a few decades ago, how Japan moved from being a low-cost manufacturer into being a high-quality, high-tech producer. This is essentially the process that China is going through, but China is going through this phase at a much greater scale and greater pace, and with such a transformative, world-changing impact, because these new technologies that we're seeing, AI and 5G, electric vehicles, fast trains, all these areas of innovation out of China are really changing the world and will change the way industry works, the way things happen in the future. So it's an important question. Is China getting an edge on the US? Does this matter? Does it matter where these new technologies emerge from? Does it actually make any difference to the rest of the world? Obviously, it makes a difference to the US, but does it actually matter to the rest of us? Well, already we're seeing the backlash. Already within days, we're getting claims that DeepSeek has perhaps taken all of its technology from OpenAI, the US company, whose models, however, are not openly available. So that raises questions about how did this happen. We're getting claims that DeepSeek have somehow avoided all of the US sanctions and all of the US economic barriers on China accessing advanced high-powered chips, that those economic coercive measures that have been put in place since Trump and reinforced in the Biden years, where the US has been trying to prevent high technology from getting to China. Has DeepSeek somehow got around this, or did they stockpile high-powered chips before those bans came into place? And now, of course, in the last day or so, we're getting claims, predictable claims again, that DeepSeek will be a security risk because it's based in China, because it will be gathering huge amounts of data, and that data will go back to China. So all of these are pretty predictable responses to the sudden arrival of a new tech competitor. It reminds me very much of the reaction to the rise of Huawei, which I've written about extensively in my book, A New Era of Risk, but I won't talk so much about Huawei today as just to observe the trend that's happening here. So China has been going through this process of, as a nation, at the government level, promoting this idea of becoming a high-tech power. So there have been lots of subsidies, just as we see subsidies, by the way, in other countries, but China has applied subsidies in a particularly smart, you could say, way. Of course, if you're a competitor with China, you could say in an unfair way, and these are matters of important debate, and there's no doubt there are many hidden subsidies in the Chinese system. Arguably, there are some hidden subsidies and quite open subsidies in other big tech players as well. But in the case of China, there has been a state-guided strategy to move towards being a high-tech country, a high-tech innovator. But it's not just about the state-led strategy, but also a bottom-up strategy, because actually this has been very much private sector led. And so just as we saw the development of Shenzhen in southern China, just across the border from Hong Kong, we've seen Shenzhen become this enormous American Silicon Valley of private sector operators, very competitive environment where companies rise and fall very quickly. And that environment, that ecosystem of competition, of scale, of having lots and lots of tech innovators in the same place, recruiting talent, etc. We've seen the rise of Huawei, we've seen the rise of BYD and DJI, which is the world's leading drone producer. But now we have DeepSeek coming from Hangzhou, which is another city in China, a little bit to the north, but still in southern China, roughly. And in Hangzhou, of course, that's where Alibaba comes from. And again, just like Shenzhen, this is an ecosystem of private sector players. So it doesn't play to the stereotype about China at all. This is actually, if we look beneath the stereotype, this is about a very competitive private sector environment. Now, there's no doubt that the state in China has regulations and has a broader strategy around how this technology shift should occur. Arguably, every country ought to have lots of regulations around tech, so that's another discussion for another day. But the interesting phenomenon here is that DeepSeek is a private sector player. It's owned by a hedge fund. It appears, on the basis of information available so far, not to have relied on huge amounts of subsidies that we can see. It seems to be a private sector phenomenon. And why wouldn't there be this kind of innovation happening in China when at scale we have this transition into becoming a high-tech innovator? We have 5 million engineers graduating from Chinese universities every year. We have this enormously competitive environment. China, of course, is the biggest trading power now in the world. And so just as Alibaba is such an important e-commerce trading platform, no doubt, if DeepSeek is successful, and if this week's launch of its product is any signal, then it will go on to be a major player in the AI race, in the race to these new technologies, the new way that industry is going to work, the new way that we as individuals are going to engage with technology will increasingly be using AI. So there are a couple of scenarios here. One scenario that's the very popular, fashionable one is that the world's dividing and that the US and China must compete here, and that the US response to China rising needs to be use tariffs, use restrictive measures, use economic coercion, and the power that the US state has to try and prevent China from developing these high technology capabilities, and to try and use coercion on third countries as well to prevent them from allowing high-tech products to get into China, or to try and restrict supply chains. So that's a fashionable view in the United States and amongst some of the United States allies. Let's ban Chinese companies. Let's consider Chinese companies security risks because of the nature of the Chinese state, that we might not quite trust it because it's not an open democratic state. Then there's the other scenario, which is that actually the risks to all of us from these new technologies come from everywhere. There are risks coming from China, but there are risks coming from everywhere. Actually, these technologies are open to criminals, to cyber hackers, from teenagers in their bedrooms to seriously organised crime, or to other actors around the world, including other powers, other countries as well. It's not necessarily the predictable nation states. There may be risks coming to us from other directions. So actually, arguably, the other scenario is that we need to invest in building rules and norms and institutions, multilateral, international institutions, to regulate these new technologies, to reduce the risk, to reduce the harm. It will never remove risk. There will always be risk involved in using technologies. When you use AI, you are giving your data over. So when you use Facebook or when you use Google, you are giving your data to oligarchic companies, companies that have links to a nation state. In the case of Google and Facebook, they have links to the United States. In the case of Huawei or DeepSeek, they have links to China. The question is, which scenario do we go in? Do we go in the scenario of geopolitical contest, where we trust one side, but actually risks might be coming from everywhere? Or do we find a way to build some trust and build rules and try and embed the kind of institutions that will work? That requires us to invest in cyber security, cyber defences in every country, and to make that a real focus. Will our governments invest adequately in cyber security and the ability to deal with risks as they arise, or is it easier to just blame one country and go all the way with the other? Well, these are the questions of the future, I think, and the one thing that is certain is that there are big disruptions to come. Technological change is coming at us faster than we can imagine, and a lot of that tech change is going to come from China. So these are discussions I think we have to have.